We are live. Okay. Attendees are supposed to be in the waiting room, but I don't see. Can an attendee please just send a message or a Q&A and let us know that you can hear us? Because they're supposed to be in a waiting room, but I don't think they are. Okay, so they can hear us. Thank you for that, whoever raised the hand. Okay, so we're going to get started. It is really a privilege to be here with, as you maybe all heard me say already, this brain power, this rabbinic power to reflect on the events of January 6th. As you all know, since you're here, and for anyone watching on Facebook who doesn't know, this book, Remember and Do Not Forget, which is hard to see with the green screen background, Rabbinic Testimonies of January 6, 2021, a horrific day in American history, is a really important compilation of contributions from these and many other rabbis who helped memorialize the events of that day and give us this kind of, thought power, this rabbinic power of putting into words what we all experienced, the trauma that we all experienced, and tried to give us steps for how we can make sure that something like this never happens again. So the conversation we're going to have today, and for anyone who doesn't have the book, I really encourage you to buy it, to have it. I think making sure that we never forget something means having this physical thing with us to look at, to reflect on in the future, to share with children. I have not seen anything like this, and this came out just a couple of days after the events that took place. So thank you so much, Rabbis, Creditor, and Olitzky, for putting this book together, and of course for all of the rabbis who submitted contributions to it. So how we're going to do this is everyone is going to read their submission. They're all pretty short, and then we're going to reflect with one question. If anyone has questions that they urgently want to raise, you can put them in the Q&A, and I will try to find a moment. But of course, we have a lot of people to hear from, and I think that you're going to love their reflections and the follow-up questions, and it's going to give you, a lot of inspiration that we all need. So we're going to begin, and actually I'll quickly introduce everyone, these wonderful people: Rabbi Menachem Creditor, Rabbi Nicole Guzik, Rabbi Nicole Farkas, Rabbi Sydney Mintz, Rabbi Rachel Ain, Rabbi Jesse Olitzky, and Rabbi Jonathan Blake. And I would be remiss to not say that Rabbis Farkas and Blake are members of the Zionist board, and we're particularly grateful to have them as part of this conversation. So, Rabbi Creditor, please read to us. Please share with us. I'm going to spotlight you.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm so glad that we get to do this. And I'm so sorry that we're doing this. I'm so sorry for the need. I never felt as strongly about the prayer for the government as I did today. I remember many years ago feeling ambivalent about the prayer for the government recited in synagogues every Shabbat morning. Were we sanctifying the policies of an administration? What of political leaders who would use religious language in pursuit of their particular agendas? I wondered, isn't God bigger than that? My feelings have changed as I've grown older, but never have I prayed as deeply for the government of the United States as I did today, upon witnessing a violent mob attack our nation's capital. Professional journalists and smartphone-wielding citizens have made clear that we are in dire need of heaven's help. As I type applicable, and my response has been a worried, stumbling prayer. Please, God, protect our government's leaders who have been whisked away from the very heart of America because of the threat of physical harm. Regardless of a citizen's political commitments regarding small government or universal health care, fiscal conservatism, or foreign policy, the ancient sage Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest of his day, one should pray for the welfare of the government, as were it not for the fear of the government, every person would swallow their neighbor alive. Today's despicable violence in Washington, D.C. proved him right. The common good is a fragile thing, and its Jewish history is replete with examples of just how easy it can be for a leader to incite societal fissures. Just this week, we read in the Torah of Pharaoh's successful method of incremental dehumanization of our ancestors. Just this week, we read in the Torah Pharaoh's successful method of incremental dehumanization of our ancestors, fomenting a division between us, the Israelites, and them, the real Egyptians. Jews have learned to trust the psalmist, but we have also learned to ask heaven's help in appointing leaders who will act in good trust. In other words, we pray that our government will succeed at keeping faith with the people it is called to serve. The desecration of America's national symbols today, the wielding of weapons on the Congress floor, the assault on law enforcement and the leaders they are sworn to protect is not only the action of a riotous mob, it was nothing less than an assault on the health of our country, an act of American blasphemy. A faithful person, according to the great American civil rights leader, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, holds God and man in one thought at all times, who suffers harm done to others, whose greatest passion is compassion, whose greatest strength is love and defiance of despair. When a Jew beseeches God to protect the government, God will explicitly intervene in a historical moment. A prayer for the government is a kind of citizen's Hippocratic oath. We pledge to protect each other from harm. This prayer is a traditional commitment to society's welfare, a ritualized way of ingraining in the collective Jewish conscience the biggest command of all, loving our neighbors as ourselves. So let us pray. Let us pray.
Thank you, Menachem. I really love that reflection. I didn't know that actually there was a prayer for the government, and I have never prayed for the government. So I was particularly moved by how you spoke about how you feel differently about that now, how you didn't feel so connected to that particular prayer before, and now you do. And of course, now we have a new government. And while a lot has changed and will continue to change, of course, so much has and will continue to stay the same. You and I have talked about how the fight for justice, for equity is not new, even though we do feel like maybe we have a new beginning here. This is not, none of these battles that we are facing post January 6th are truly new battles for the soul of America. So what do you pray for now from our government, and how much is outside the hands of the government? What do you pray for from us, the people, the activists, like all of us on this call?
I so appreciate the question, Amanda, and I'll try to answer very briefly. I was just watching the Star Wars, the most recent ones with my kids, and there's a moment where all hope feels lost, and the bad guys say, "Yeah, but they don't have a navy. Where are all these ships coming from?" And the answer is, it's not a navy, it's just people. And in fact, I think that's my deepest prayer, for us to recognize. I know that I'm coming in and out, sorry for the connection. My biggest prayer is for us to recognize that the power is in the people, but the people must remember. We have to learn our own history, which means going far beyond January 6th and far beyond 4 years. The inequities in society predate any administration, and so much of what we consider American success is based upon slavery and the subjugation of other people. And so I think my prayer for the government today is not simple at all, but can be said simply. We need to learn our own history so that, as Heschel also taught us, I might not be guilty of the specific wrongs that I'm reacting to right now, but I'm a stakeholder in this free society. I am responsible. So my prayer is actually not at members of Congress or the president. My prayer is to the people that we should recognize that we need each other, that there's no beloved community if we don't take responsibility for owning our history and building a better next chapter.
Thank you. I know the questions are a little bit big for the amount of time we have for everyone to reflect, but these are rabbis and they know how to use words really powerfully. So thank you so much for that. And Rabbi Nicole Guzik from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, you are spotlighted.
Hi, everyone. Good morning here from the West Coast. And Rabbi Creditor, I loved your reflection. Thank you so much for that. So in writing my piece, I just wanted to preface it with, like many of the rabbis on this call, my children are currently in school virtually. And so what a shock it was to actually watch this riot with my 9-year-old daughter, and how painful it was to watch it with her. And I felt the need to write this reflection after. Like many of you, my heart shattered as I watched the insurrection at the US Capitol. News blaring in the background, tears streaming down my face, I thought, what am I teaching my children? As a collective society blessed to live in this beautiful country, what are we teaching our children? As a rabbi who daily beseeches God to extend heaven's peace onto this earth, what do our children need to hear and glean from this very moment, from this year, through this trauma and ravaged emotional state? And so to my children, I will teach. You are safe in my arms, and I will do everything in my power to protect you. But as human beings, as Jews, we must stand together and ensure that same privilege of safety for every child of God. You have the right to use your voice, but to always remember words hold the power to create and likewise hold the power to destroy. Use your words to build worlds, create sacred connections, and lift souls. Let your voice be a beacon of light. You are better than the images of hate and destruction displayed across our screens. Use your hands for moments of embrace. Channel your anger and rage through acts of loving kindness. Choose role models that engage in civil dialogue and productive conversation. Seek paths that lead to understanding. You plant the seeds for a better tomorrow. My children, as much as we want to close our eyes at this dark moment in history, widen your gaze. Remember that you are the change makers. You are the bearers of peace. Observe, feel, absorb, learn. But then, my precious babies, with determination and persistence, fight for a brighter future for yourself and for generations to come. According to the Midrash, the angels questioned and interrogated God in the decision to create human beings. And God gave a convincing rebuttal, remarking on human beings' wisdom and intellect. And even though the traditional text seems to highlight humanity's mental discernment, I implore all of us to teach our children that true wisdom is paired with the heart. We inherit a world in which too often our hearts remain closed, shut off, disengaged with that which seems frightening or different. Open those eyes. Open those hearts. I will teach my children to always be worthy of their creation. Amanda, I can't hear.
Sorry, I was muted. I just love that so much. And it's an extra treat knowing you and knowing how committed you are to that. And you talk about how to raise the next generation and to make sure they know what they're worthy of and how to use their words and their wisdom to bring about a better world. And you and Rabbi Ain both in your submissions talk about the power of words and modeling behavior off of words, or the impact that words have on modeling behavior. And so I'm wondering from you, beyond the verbal lessons, how adults, how parents can actually model better conduct, because so much of it, of course, is about words, but a lot of parents may or may not, say to their kids, I want you to be better. I want you to do good and to be good, and maybe aren't necessarily modeling that. And, so many people, so many in the Jewish community are maybe Jewishly involved, maybe not, but they're busy, people are busy. So what are the simplest ways that we can model what the very inspiring words that you said beyond, saying those lessons? How do we be that?
No, I appreciate the question. And what I'm going to say sounds obvious and simple. And yet, as someone who's also married to a rabbi, I often find the two of us catching ourselves in actions that that we don't necessarily respect. And what I mean by that, we noticed after the presidential debates, you know, as I said, because we're at home and my 3 children are around, they're watching what we're watching. We can't shield our children from, you know, that which is happening on our screens right now. It's just, it's impossible. It feels impossible to do. And so, you know, as parents, as rabbis, we were kind of listening to our reactions, the way we were reacting to the presidential debates and the way we were reacting to the riots. And we realized everything that was coming out of our mouths, whether it was kind or not kind, was immediately modeled by our children. And at our congregation at Sinai Temple, we engaged in conversations with the parents in our community on how to have productive civil discourse, you know, within our families and within our broader congregation. And we implored our community, please feel free to disagree with what's happening on your screen, but don't use derogatory terms when speaking about the people who are presenting, because all your children will hear in the simplest way is the name calling. And they will know that their parents have condoned name calling, and that's what they'll take into the classroom. And so, like I said, it sounds very simple. Stop the name calling, stop the use of derogatory terms, but we're doing it. We are gossiping in our homes because we think no one else is hearing, but the most important people are hearing, and that's our children. And they're taking it immediately into their virtual classrooms for now, at least in Los Angeles, for now. And I can't tell you how frightening and how empowering it is to hear your children model the language that you are offering. And so in the same way that I wrote in the reflection, you can use your words to build, or you can use your words to destroy, but always be aware that your children are listening. And if I can just follow up with that for just 1 second, I received a great response to my reflection. Many great responses, but one in particular was the hope that people realize children, you are a parent to children in the widest of senses, meaning that anytime you are speaking, realize that children are listening. They may not be your biological children, whatever it may be. They may not be the children that live in your home. You're always a teacher when you use your words. So I just wanted to make sure that that was conveyed.
Thank you. And I agree. It seems like a simple question. How do we show people that we want them to be good people by being good people? But it isn't always that simple, because of course we all have emotions. We all react, you know. It's very hard to make sure that every time you open your mouth that you're modeling good behavior. And obviously that's too much to ask. No one can constantly, you know, be perfect in how they express themselves, but there are ways, and words do beget action. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, to my friend Rabbi Jonathan Blake from Westchester Reformed Temple in Westchester, New York.
Hi, friends. So nice to be with you, and so nice to be included in the good company of the other people on this panel. So welcome, one and all. I'm going to tell a little bit of a meta story, and I'm going to narrate by way of a photograph. And then if you want to read the actual wording of my inordinately brief selection, you're welcome to pick up the book. So on January 5th, with gratitude to my congregation, Westchester Reformed Temple in Scarsdale, I began a 3-month sabbatical, which is, halavai, God willing, to be experienced in 2 winter installments in 2 consecutive years. So I have the 3 months off between January 5 and April 5 of this year, and God willing, we'll be able to repeat the 2nd installment of the sabbatical winter of 2022. That's by way of background for how I reacted on the morning of, or the midday on the 6th of January, which was my first full day off and thinking that I'm a man freed from my obligation to be in touch with my congregation and going to let my stalwart clergy team handle everything that comes their way. And so as I watched the TV that morning, I almost never turn on the TV, but I had seen a news flash come in from the New York Times on my iPhone, and I turned on the news. I turned on TV, and I guess my first reaction was, oh my God, they're storming the Capitol. And then my second reaction, which came only a fraction of a second later, was, for crying out loud, I have to write to the congregation now. So somebody asked in the Q&A section if these were spontaneous reflections, and more or less. I mean, these are reflections that I wrote within 24 hours of the insurrection. Like all of us, I was absolutely horrified by what I was seeing, but it was kind of like watching a car crash. I couldn't look away. But in terms of what I wanted to communicate to my congregation, I always try to root my messaging in Torah, in Jewish values, and to make it clear that rabbis and synagogues and clergy exist and Jewish community exists to provide something qualitatively different from what a person can get from a journalist on the news or in a print publication. And I really try to be cognizant of the uniqueness of the rabbinic role or the clergy role in serving Jewish communities. You can turn on the TV and hear any number of voices of outrage, but what specifically Jewish could I have to contribute to the conversation? And then I was struck by this image, which was widely shared. It really went viral within the first day or so. Most of you have probably seen it. Glennon Doyle gave it a lot of internet traffic. It purports to depict two young female Senate staffers carrying the box, or a box, and you can see there's another box behind the two in the front, carrying boxes that allegedly contained the ballots that were cast by the legislators with regard to the legitimacy of the election. And the thinking behind the picture is that, look at these brave young women who are carrying these ballots to safety away from the rioting mob, who had surely nefarious designs for these ballots. They were going to destroy them, they were going to steal them, they were going to use them to prove that the whole election was a fraud, what have you. And so I saw these two women, and of course, with that as the narrative being told about them at that time, within the first hours of the insurrection, I had a sudden moment of recognition to an image from that week's Torah portion, in which is the first portion in the book of Exodus, Shemot, in which two Hebrew midwives take it upon themselves to defy the edict of the tyrannical Pharaoh, who had condemned the baby Hebrew boys to be drowned in the Nile, so this genocidal order. And of course, it was the brave midwives, Shifra and Pua by name, who defied the Pharaoh's order, even at peril of their own life and safety. And they saved the day, and perhaps it's people who are not going to be front and center and taking up the top headlines in the news who deserve the most admiration, praise, and credit. And I figured I would give them a little bit of a loving salute. And so my remarks do that. It's really just one paragraph saluting these women who bravely carried the ballots to safety without any desire for fanfare or reward. They simply did the right thing. And they deserve our recognition and praise. Now, all of that is the backstory. What later came to light is that this photo was taken before the insurrection, and they are probably bringing the ballots to the rotunda where the legislators would later that morning gather for the proceedings. Nevertheless, somebody did have the presence of mind to get those ballots out of harm's way and to bring them to safety. And perhaps even more poetically, we may never know the faces, names, or identities of those people. But somebody behind the scenes, many people behind the scenes that day, were quietly doing the right thing. And I think that it's important to recognize that even when we are in a state of shock and horror at, the unfolding of chaos and evil right in front of our eyes. And of course, bad news is what sells. But I think that our message, our Jewish message, needs to be one of where can we find hope in times that are rife with anxiety and dismay. So I find hope in the knowledge that our institutions and our democratic norms and traditions nevertheless have held fast, even as they have been assailed. So I'm grateful to not just these women, but to all who, like them, were interested in carrying out their democratic responsibilities that day and not undermining them. So thank you. And again, if you want to read my piece in the book, when I tell you it's short, I mean it is this short. It's called The Story's Real Heroes, and that's the whole thing. So you're looking at it right now. You've probably already read it. Thanks so much for listening.
I was nervous that you were going to answer my question, not that I couldn't come up with another question, because of course I did ask to expound given how short your contribution was, but also because you did give in your presentation just now a little bit more background on Shifra and Pua. And, so of course I think it's important for people who are watching who are not necessarily as biblically versed to know a bit more about these women and why they are so heroic. I think of them a little differently. So I'm definitely hoping you can give more of how you viewed, even of course, knowing that those two women were not removing the ballots from the Capitol, from the chambers at that moment. But let's say they were, for the sake of reflecting. I think of what Shifra and Pua did as being much more conscious of their decision to defy someone, whereas those women, had they been, acting in that moment, it was just a quick, super reflective, like impulsive recognition that in this moment we have to be the heroes. And so for people who don't necessarily always have that instinctive reaction of how to save the day, how do we be more conscious and intentional about saving the day, right? Like, how do we be more like Shifra and Pua?
Well, look, there have been a goodly number of other Shifraot and Puot, Shifras and Puas, who are deserving of our gratitude. I think, for instance, of, state officials like Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger from Georgia, who has, even like Anthony Fauci, who from the day he started contradicting the president of the United States, has been subjected to death threats and envelopes filled with white powder. It is not just, this is not just a game for these people. They and their loved ones have been put in harm's way because of their willingness to speak out. And not, out of a sense of civil disobedience. They're just doing the right thing, and they're showing up every day and saying, I've got a job to do, and I'm going to do my job. And my job is to perform an important function for the safe functioning of American democracy. So, for every single person who behind a camera, or who without any kind of, journalist putting a microphone and a camera in front of his or her face, has quietly been executing the function of American democracy, I salute you.
Thank you. So next up is Rabbi Noah Farkas from Valley Beth Shalom in Los Angeles as well.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see my friends all in one place. It's really nice to see you, even though we haven't really been in the same room for so long now, but it's really great to be here. And Amanda, thank you to helping organize this. Zioness continues to blow me away, and your leadership continues to blow me away. And a special thank you to Rabbi Olitzky and Rabbi Creditor for putting this volume together. Rabbi Creditor especially, you have repeatedly outdone yourself time and time again, reaching forward and amplifying the right kind of rabbinic voices. So I want to thank you for that. So quick little thing, and I'll read my piece. I write a weekly Devar Torah, and I usually write it early in the week, and then it gets published on Thursdays. And so I wrote an entire Devar Torah, had it edited, ready to go, and then January 5th happened on Wednesday. And here it was in the morning, not in the afternoon. And by the time lunchtime rolled around, I had to throw out everything I had written and rewrote this piece very quickly because I had to say something. The topic of my piece, which I'll read now, is about questions not political or even communal. They're much more existential. We find that many of us allow ourselves to diminish our self-understanding to be the smallest version of ourselves. And so I explore how that sort of tendency, that reflex, actually plays into the hands of oppression, and how what happened on January 5th should not define us, and should not define us as human beings, and shouldn't define us as a country. So I write, and by the way, some of the facts have changed because we know, for example, more people died than when we knew back on January 5th and January 6th. So forgive me for those now factual errors. As the events unfolded yesterday on Capitol Hill, I, like so many, was taken aback by the brazen and swift insurrection by domestic terrorists. 4 people died and dozens of peace officers were wounded. The Confederate flag, a symbol of hatred and racism, was paraded through Statuary Hall for the first time in U.S. history. It was shameful and embarrassing as a nation to see what has been a platform for stability in the world, the U.S. government, become so exposed so quickly. While the riot lasted only a short time, it is enough to ask abiding questions about our democracy, our values, and the very fabric of our country. At one point, I posted about how embarrassed I was, saying, "We are better than this." And I was surprised by the pushback I received, questioning whether America and people in general are better than being a mob. Critics quickly pointed out that one can draw a, quote, straight line from the Compromise of 1877, which ended the Reconstruction era, to the riot. Others took a more existential view, sending memes and questioning whether or not people are capable of anything like progress. Curiously, many of the interlocutors of my post are some of the most progressive people I know. This bewildering moment in history is a reckoning. There is no question of that. But what is it a reckoning of exactly? Is it political, social, or communal? It's hard to say in even the ever nebulous haze of the present tense, but to me, the question all of us must deal with is deeper. It is an inner question. It is a spiritual question. Who are we really? Who are we when we are looked upon, and who are we when no one is looking? Is there more to the human spirit than vicious animus, or are we made of more sacred stuff? I find it cynical to simply agree with the prejudice that modern science tells us about our conception of the self. Many neuroscientists say that the self can be reduced to 100 million or so whiffs of pulp firing off inside our heads. Our mental life comprising our thoughts, ambitions, passions, our love, our fear, everything that we think of as our most intimate selves is simply the activity of these little specks of jelly. If there is anything that runs through our tradition as Jews, is that progress is possible. And tomorrow does not have to look like yesterday. Liberation is possible. Goodness is sovereign, even if clouded or eclipsed by the particular moments of chaos. And each of us carries God's trademark, the very imaginative capacity to create a world that is better than the one we see. There is something more than our biological selves that extends through time. We are more than a neurological dance party, only chasing to satiate our desires and fulfill what we think of as our needs. We create art. We tell stories. We are part of communities. All of these extensions tell us that our mental center is more than a jello mold inside our skulls. They lead us in a direction that says that we can imagine realities that do not exist and bring those realities into existence. This is what it means to feel created by a creator. God's greatest gift to each of us is to give us the imagination to hope and that goodness and peace are actually possible. One of God's very names, after all, is peace. There is more to us than our physical strength or weakness, as the prophet Zechariah said. Power is not the theme of being, but goodness is. Life, the philosopher Martin Buber writes, is more than the sum of goal-directed verbs. The entirety of ourselves is not found in the manipulation of things or of people or even of experiences. The I in each of us is something that lives in the world and through it in relation to something much greater than each of ourselves. We are, as the writer David Foster Wallace writes, both flesh and not. In this week's Torah portion, Shemot, we find a world of similar static chaos, where every day for hundreds of years looks like every other day. There was no rest, no liberation, no change, just the building of bricks and the suffering under oppression. This vision, a world created by Pharaoh, believes that all relationships can be reduced to simple power dynamics. Either you are weak or strong, you are the oppressor or the oppressed. Into this world is born Moses, a slave from a no-name family, cast into the river and raised a prince only to flee into exile. In the 3rd chapter, Moses meets God for the first time in the form of a burning bush. As he's standing in intimacy with the divine for the first time in his life, Moses asks 2 powerful questions. The first is, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? And the second, Moses asks, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is God's name? What shall I say to them? Moses, standing on holy ground, asks the same questions we ask on this very day. Who am I, and who are you? Moses, perhaps more than any other character in the Torah, is torn by his competing identities. He has the privilege of a prince, and he carries the oppression of a slave. He is an Egyptian, he is a Jew, he is a foreigner, he is a native. He is capable of murder and violence, and he is capable of incredible love. It is no surprise that in all the complexity of his identity, Moses feels confused and even unworthy to carry out the task of liberation that God has asked of him. Like many of us, Moses' sense of self has become muddled. And just like Moses, our identities, our varying capacities for viciousness and compassion, commingle with our sense of self-worth. It becomes easy to slink back into the shambling mound of our baser instincts. The rabbis expand Moses' question to more mirror our own, as if to say, quote, I am a shepherd and he is Pharaoh. Of what importance am I to speak with such kings? Like so many of us, Moses reduces his life to the narrowest and lowest of identities. If we take his question seriously, Moses is not just being humble. He feels the fear, the confusion, and the ambiguity that comes along with all questions of who we really are. His fear enervates. His self-conception debilitates. How many of us, like Moses, ask the question, who am I, and respond with the smallest and most narrowest of answers? I am weak. I am nothing. I don't deserve it. Who am I to stand up and stick my neck out? Why should I try if this is all we are? It's hard to know what you believe in if you don't first believe in yourself. Moses' second question breaks open the conundrum of the first. When asking the question, who is God, the answer given by God is Eheyeh asher eheyeh, which is often translated incorrectly to be I am what I am, implicitly saying that God is inscrutable and unknowable. But the Hebrew is clear and does answer Moses' question. The Hebrew literally means I will be what I will be. God's name is in the future tense, not in the present tense, as if to say, we already know what is in the world. The world can be discovered. What we do not know is the future. This is God's very gift to Moses and to us and to the world. The rabbis say that when God revealed God's self to the masses, God appeared as a mirror, reflecting the myriad of Israelites in the light of Revelation. In God's mirror, we find the answer to our deepest questions. Never before has a culture said that your tomorrows do not have to look like your yesterdays. Never before has a book said that the part of you that feels unworthy, enslaved, downtrodden, and disempowered can be lifted up and liberated. God's answer to the question of who we are is that we can live for a future that we cannot see yet, but can only imagine. We were created by the Creator, dreamed of by the Dreamer, so that we can be a dream, and we can inspire, and we can overcome, and we can redeem. Our heart center is not found in our cells or organs. It is our divine capacity to imagine a world, to repent for our misgivings, to repair the breach, to forgive trespass, and to liberate the soul. It is the life we lead towards greatness. God's name in Exodus is ours, and ours is God's. We will be what we will ourselves to be. At this moment in history, we cannot answer the question, who am I, with only the smallest, most narrow of answers. We are better than our darkest proclivities. We are never the worst decisions we've ever made. We are capable of so much more. If we make the turn towards the future, if we choose to see the light, if we look into God's mirror, we can grow, we can change, and we can speak with kings, and we can claim our place. When we extend ourselves beyond our limits and partner with what is holy, we can tell the most important story of all, the story of goodness.
Thank you. That was so beautiful. I am going to cling to a piece of it because you reflected on so many different themes. I think there's a theme running throughout that is something that you and I have talked a lot about, that Zionist really is focused a lot on, which is, what does it mean to pursue progress? What does it mean to be a progressive? And I'm going to out you for a really interesting exchange on your Facebook about this, where you posted about how, and you talk about this as well, how you posted that that we're better than this, and you got a lot of pushback on that. So how do you view, and just the way that you engaged on this topic in this Facebook thread was, I think, so enlightening and so important for those of us who care about progress, how to be that, how to think about America as redeemable, to think about all of the work that we have to do, but to know that we can get there, even though it's not happening as quickly as we wish that it would.
Yeah, as I sort of wrote about, the idea that you believe in a brighter future is exactly the kind of idea that's seated in the book of Exodus. It's exactly the kind of idea that the Torah brings into culture that never really existed before. And that we Jews have never been satisfied with the world as it unfolds before us. And that we are always looking over the horizon for something greater and something more powerful. And I think that the founders of our country, of the United States, pulled on that to create the mythos around American democracy. And we can get into the political conversations about particular compromises and things that happen along the way. But if you don't feel that America can be better than it is, then there are no times where you can say that you have a dream, or that you can say that we can be a shining city on the hill, or that you believe in progress and that you shouldn't even fight for that progress. It all begins with this idea, Amanda, that when asked the question who we are as human beings, we cannot answer that question with the smallest part of ourselves. We have to answer the question with the largest, most prophetic part of ourselves. And to me, that is inherently Jewish. And it's not only in our culture, it exists in other culture, but we wrote about it thousands of years ago, and it's indigenous to who we are.
Thank you. I love that. Okay, Rabbi Rachel Ain from Sutton Place Synagogue in New York City.
Hi, everybody. So as Amanda shared, this will evoke some of the messages that Rabbi Guzik shared as well, though her audience was to her children, but therefore to all of our children. My audience was more to the adult crowd, but sometimes, as actually Rabbi David Wolpe, Nicole's colleague, shared, that in order to really understand something, you need to be able to share it with children, and then it will be communicated. Friends, we've all been reflecting on this week, on the events of this week that took place in our nation's capital. Our country was rocked as we witnessed scenes of the Confederate flags in the Capitol, individuals with Camp Auschwitz and 6MWE, 6 million weren't enough t-shirts. The sacred halls of Congress were ransacked, forcing our elected officials under their desks. These were painful images for all of us. Leaders who incited and displayed sympathy for these rioters were not only unacceptable, but dangerous. Words matter, and we cannot excuse speech that seeks to undermine our democracy. Sorry, the voices of children is the greatest. Many political commentators and other experts will have much to weigh in on regarding the impact of this week on America. But we are reminded that Judaism teaches that words have the power to create worlds and words have the power to destroy worlds. I've been trying to find the proper response to the events of this week, and I'm honored to be on the executive committee of the New York Board of Rabbis, who, in partnership with many other faith leaders, penned the following statement. Our respective faith traditions require that we make moral distinctions in our lives between the permitted and the prohibited. We distinguish between civil discourse and malicious denigration, peaceful protest and insurrection. We cannot be silent when we hear and see those willingly violate the core values of our democracy. As faith leaders, we expound from our pulpits and our communities that words have consequences. We understand the responsibility of preaching truth, justice, loving kindness. What we say with our mouths may influence what others do with their hands. We expect that our president and those in positions of leadership to create the common ground upon which we can respectfully disagree with one another without demonizing an opponent as the enemy. The bronze statue of freedom crowns the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. as a beacon of hope and union for all Americans. Freedom of speech does not permit or condone incitement or insurgency. The storming of the United States Capitol is unjustifiable, and those who perpetuated this violence must be lawfully punished. We commend our congressional leaders who, in a bipartisan decision, reconvened following the desecration and dangerous display of violence to certify the electoral results. They demonstrated to the world that our democracy will not be deterred by anyone seeking its destruction. We pray that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris will lead our country with decency and dignity so that we may continue to live in a democracy, not a mobocracy, with room for all to respect one another. These voices of religious leaders from across the religious and political spectrum offer all of us a glimmer of hope, I wrote. At a moment when our country feels broken, we must use our words as they are intended, to create, not to destroy, to build up, not to tear down. And we must look for moments of light seeping through the darkness to remind us that though weeping may tarry for the night, joy will come in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, you know, as mentioned, it was a similar message with Rabbi Guzik, but also different, really different in a lot of ways. And I'm interested in hearing from you about how, you know, so many of the words that we hear now from our national leadership today are obviously completely different from what we have heard from political leadership in the recent past, but there are also a lot of words coming out of Congress and then beyond political leadership, you know, in civic and social leadership, and this is across the ideological spectrum, that has the potential to do real and serious damage. So beyond the way that we use our words to inspire and to do good, how do we find the courage to find the words to challenge bad? You know, it takes so much right now to speak up, especially with people that you do social justice work with, or you may sit with for Shabbat, or you serve in Congress with. How do we encourage people to do that really, really hard work of using their words, not just to inspire, you know, not like for the people who are not using their words well, how do we use our words to overcome that?
So I think we need to start, local. And at the end of the day, relationships matter and conversations matter. And one thing that our congregation has been really focusing on is how do we dialogue with one another? And 4 years ago, in that in-between period of November 2016 and January 2017, when President Obama was still president and President-elect Trump was almost president, and there was a controversial vote at the UN regarding Israel, and we saw how the Jewish community did not know how to speak to each other. And that to me was sort of a marker of the beginning of so many problems. I'm sure there were many problems before, and a congregant and I decided we need to get our congregants together. And 3 or 4 times a year for the last 4 years, we come together around challenging issues, and we send out articles that have different viewpoints. And we say, you're going to come together, we're going to come together, and we're going to talk about them. And we're going to listen to each other. And we did that this past Monday night, the first day of Black History Month, on the issue of Jews and racial justice, and knowing that it's not always to hear about white privilege when you're mainly a white middle to upper class congregation, but you need to be able to talk about it. We need to hear the voices of those who have been in pain. We need to hear from a young woman, a Jewish woman of color, who said to many people several decades her senior, I know you don't realize it, but when I want to come to shul with African-American Jews and they see police standing outside the synagogue, we understand why those police are there, and we appreciate why they're there, and we know why they need to be there. For you had swastikas on your door, and yet it's hard for us to see. We can only challenge each other, and we can only change opinions and create empathy by listening to each other. And the problem, and ironically, while this is such an important conversation we're having right now, we're speaking into the air. We're not able to dialogue with one another. And I really believe it has to start local, so that when we see what's going on in the news, we can talk to each other about how much we're in pain.
Okay, so how do we move your synagogue initiative into Congress and the world and every community? I mean, wow, thank you.
So my son, this is a sort of, I have a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. And last week, or a few weeks ago, I was taking my son to school, my 15-year-old, and he turned to me and said, Mom, would you run for president? And I looked at him and I said, no, would you? I don't know. And it was actually a really special moment that it didn't occur to him that it would be that I could or couldn't run, that why wouldn't I run for president? But I think we just need to keep modeling that there are people who can run for president, who can be our leaders, who can offer these voices, and that we just need to be part of that dialogue.
Thank you. I totally agree. Thank you. Okay, so next is Rabbi Jesse Olitzky from Congregation Beth in New Jersey.
Thank you, Amanda. I want to preface what I wrote by saying that I initially started writing this piece to share with my congregation. It's very raw, filled with a lot of rage. Started writing it as I was sitting on my computer. I have dual screens here in my office. One screen I'm writing, and on the side screen, I'm watching the live stream of these 24-hour news cycles as the insurrection is taking place. I finished writing this piece that evening. Our congregation wasn't sure what to do, and we always have a morning minyan. We never have an evening minyan, and we decided to get together for a virtual evening minyan that night to pray together because there's power in communal prayer, we believe. And I felt oddly better, not okay, but better in that moment, being surrounded virtually by community members, knowing that we share the same ideals and that we're fighting for the same idea of what America is not yet, but what our idea of America should be. I finally fell asleep in the early hours of Wednesday morning, dozing off as election results from 24-hour news networks continued to flicker on the television mounted to the wall. Networks had declared Reverend Raphael Warnock the winner of his Senate runoff election, and John Ossoff had just taken a slight lead in his race for a Senate seat. A state that once sat at the heart of white supremacy, where the Ku Klux Klan was reborn in Stone Mountain, a state that still celebrates that legacy with a monument, elected a Black pastor serving Ebenezer Baptist Church, the spiritual home of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and a 33-year-old Jew. Immediately, I thought of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the African-American man and two Jewish men who were murdered by the KKK in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964, while registering Black voters. Warnock referenced how his 82-year-old mother would pick cotton for white families, and now she was picking her son to be a United States Senator. In his victory speech, he referenced Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel saying that he prayed with his feet when he marched in Selma with Dr. King, and believed that Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King were smiling down on the Black preacher and Jewish millennial who were newly elected senators from Georgia. They were what the New South represented, a state that once celebrated segregation and discrimination was represented now by diversity and fighting for equality. But within only a few hours, there was a pendulum swing of great extremes, from a historic moment that displayed the greatest of America to a moment in which we witnessed the worst of America. Following the charge by President Trump for his followers to march up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol and quote unquote stop the steal to prevent Congress from witnessing the counting of certified electoral college votes, a violent and armed mob of his supporters, including Proud Boys who Trump had only recently told to stand back and stand by, stormed the Capitol building for the first time since the War of 1812. A violent mob of domestic terrorists waving Confederate flags and wearing MAGA hats with shirts that read Camp Auschwitz and 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, caused congressional representatives and senators to put on gas masks. Some were safely evacuated from side exits, while many were hiding on lockdown in their offices, with makeshift barricades of furniture being the only thing keeping their doors shut. I wish I could say I was shocked. I was disturbed, I was angry, I was sad, but I was not shocked, since we know what happens when you pour gasoline on a fire. And that is what President Trump has been doing since he launched his campaign in 2015, stoking hatred and fear, siding with bigots and white supremacists. All of that came to a head on Wednesday afternoon, and America is forever changed. The scars of Trump's presidency will remain long after Joe Biden takes the oath of office, and the stain of this act of terror will remain stained on the fabric of our nation. The Talmud asks if it is permitted to sequester the coins of Jerusalem within the temple, essentially hiding them. The Talmud says, "Uva uva peritzim v'cheleluha." Rabbeinu Gershom describes peritzim as sonim, as enemies who fuel hate. Here, the Talmud is teaching that enemies who fuel hate will enter the temple and immediately desecrate it by their actions. Rabbinic literature recognizes that insurrection forever causes the sanctity of an idea and the sanctity of a cause to be damaged. The sacred halls of the Capitol are forever desecrated with broken glass, with the letters "Murder the Media" carved into wooden planks and MAGA tagged onto the pillars. The Capitol has been desecrated, the temple has been sieged, but this mob of terrorists did not only desecrate the Capitol, they desecrated democracy, and democracy is incredibly fragile. Only hours after seeing the first Black senator and first Jewish senator from Georgia get elected, we saw the essence of racial disparity and brutality by the way the National Guard, who was called into action in riot gear during Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, tear gassing peaceful protesters so the president could take a photo op, weren't called to stop an act of sedition, not when the group was all white, not when some law enforcement officers were even removing barricades and taking selfies with these terrorists. The silence among some elected officials is deafening. The president telling the violent mob of his supporters to stop while still telling them he loves them and doubling down on his rigged election conspiracy theories is repulsive. And those politicians who only now call out this action, but not the president, after supporting the president and propping him up for 4+ years, after equally fanning the flames of hate and conspiracy, are insulting our intelligence. As CNN's Jake Tapper put it that afternoon, "I decry violence," said the senator, while spilling gunpowder and gasoline all over the building and handing out matches. When Moses is grown, he wanders out of Pharaoh's palace and sees a taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. He sees the direct result of his adoptive family's policies. He sees the direct result of his choice to be silent. And the Torah tells us, "V'yifen kol v'cho v'yar ki ein ish." Then Moses turns this way and that way to see if there's any person around. We make the assumption that he did so to ensure that he wouldn't get caught before he stood up to the taskmaster. He looked around to make sure, ein ish, that there's literally no man, no person present. But we know that not to be the case. The Israelites were aware of Moses standing up to the taskmaster when they mentioned it to him the very next day, because there were people around. They were everywhere. These were slaves in the middle of the desert. There was nowhere to hide. So what does it mean that ein ish, that there was no man present? The sage Hillel tells us in Pirkei Avot, "B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel liot ish." In a place where there are no worthy persons, strive to be a worthy person. Moses saw people around, but no one was willing to step up and stop what was happening. And that was when he knew he had to. It came at quite the cost. He left the palace and the life of material wealth. He fled to Midian and became a shepherd. So I am unimpressed with a politician who edits their press release with a fine-tooth comb because they're more concerned with their own future political aspirations than they are with repudiating a tyrannical modern-day pharaoh. I'm encouraged by those who choose country over party and integrity over Trump. We need more people like Moses. The Torah tells us that no one ever again saw God panim el panim, face to face, like Moses did. But Moses was far from flawless. He too lost his cool as a leader. He was not able to enter the promised land. Still, I would settle for someone who was willing to step up, even and especially when no one else has. It's easy to condemn when all around you is condemnation. It is courageous to do so when no one else is. It is courageous to look this way and that way, and to see the cowardice of colleagues who supposedly represent we the people, who remain silent because they only represent themselves and choose to speak up and call out an act of terrorism. When there are no worthy people, strive to be a worthy person. This biblical narrative will lead to our eventual exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, as Moses is tasked with taking the Israelites from slavery to freedom. Mitzrayim is often understood to mean Mitzarim, from narrow places. Moses is tasked with taking the Israelites and humanity out of a tyrannical fanaticism that is based on narrow-mindedness. On Wednesday, January 6th, at the Capitol, we saw the worst of that narrow-mindedness. We saw that hatred and bigotry. We saw the violence and insurrection. But only hours earlier, we saw an example of light with the election of someone who is unapologetically religious and progressive, one who uses his faith to unite and not divide, to preach love and justice, living Amos's prophetic vision that Dr. King could only dream about. Together, we will keep on spreading that same message. We'll keep on spreading a message of spiritual resistance. We'll keep on spreading a message of love. We will strive to be like Moses, and we will not let anyone else's narrowness and hatred cause us to fear. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav taught, Kol ha'ulam kulo gesher tzar ma'od. The whole world is a narrow bridge. Throughout the world, we'll confront the narrowness of hatred and bigotry, of fundamentalism and extremism. V'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. But the essence is that we shall not fear. Amanda, I think you're muted.
I don't know how I muted myself, but thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I'm gonna ask Jesse Olitzky my question, but I just want to make sure everyone knows you do not want to leave before Rabbi Mintz has her chance to share with us her contribution and to close this conversation. So stick with us. Rabbi Olitzky, I know the takeaway of your piece is about Moses, and the obvious question is, how do we create more Moseses, or how do we all be more like Moses? But that seems like an impossibly unfair question. So I'm going to ask you a different impossibly unfair question, which is about the Black-Jewish partnership. And you focus on Senators Asaf and Warnock and their extraordinary victory, not from a partisan political sense, but just from a historical sense, and what they are modeling for all of us who care about coalition building and standing up for the marginalized and working together to advance justice for all of us. And, this is a thing, of course, that the Jewish community is looking at a lot. And we haven't had, I think we look often back, and I know there are reflections even in the book on the relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. We haven't had such a visual of such a profound Black-Jewish partnership that we've been in a very long time, like the one that we see in these new senators from Georgia. So how do we expand on their success? How do we build on it? And I know this is a very challenging question, but I know it's something that you care a lot about and think a lot about. How do we, on a more local level, do what they are doing in modeling what it means to stand together and fight for each other?
It's a good question. I would say, right, it's problematic when we reflect on events of a civil rights movement that was, 75 years ago, almost to really 70 years ago, to really highlight partnership between Black and Jewish communities and shared values. I would say two things. One, I want us to be careful when we talk about Black-Jewish partnership, because that assumes that or really clarifies or generalizes the Jewish community in this country as white, when that also ostracizes so many people who fall into both circles as Jews of color. I would start with Jews of color within our communities who often feel on the periphery, who often feel ostracized. They are the bridge, and they often feel the anti-Semitism, which sometimes is anti-Israel anti-Semitism, and feel like their voice is not heard within some circles that they are in. And they feel the racism, sometimes on a conscious and sometimes on a subconscious level, which they sometimes hear within our Jewish communities. I would start there, and I would say that allyship matters. Allyship is not trying to question what somebody says, right? When somebody says that they're experiencing racism, it is not my job as a white person to question them or push back on what they're defining as racist. It is my job as an ally to stand with them and hear them and listen to them and work to change a culture and a country that truthfully was really founded on racism. Right? It's not that our country is broken, that our country is existing because our founding fathers, right? Slavery was a part of the founding of this country and predates the founding of this country. And so it's to listen and hear. And similarly, for our friends and neighbors who are allies with the Jewish community, to really listen when we say something is anti-Semitic, and to not question and push back, and to hear us as well. We may not always agree, but it begins with listening. And that's really what an ally is. It's to listen, to hear, to understand, and to appreciate.
That was perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, Rabbi Sidney Mintz, I know you've been very patiently awaiting your turn. Thank you all for sticking with us. This is worth hearing. Replace pin. Okay, Rabbi Sidney Mintz from Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for hosting this. And I feel incredibly humbled to be among the company of rabbis here, and my gratitude to Menachem and to Jesse for putting this together so quickly in the moment, and actually having the book published and available to people. And I'm also humbled to be in the company of everyone who wrote a chapter. And it's interesting to end with me, because I think about the moment when former President and Prime Minister Shimon Peres of blessed memory spoke at Temple Emmanuel, and he said, "We're no longer just the people of the book, we're the people of the Facebook." And that got a huge laugh from Shimon Peres. And the reason I bring that up is because my submission was literally lifted off of my Facebook post from the day following January 6th. It was January 7th. And I thought about writing a Devar Torah. And then I recognized that my hope was that this was going to be a book that was read by Jews and non-Jews for years and years to come. And I put myself in the position of Lador Vador, thinking back, well, what was the response? Was it Divrei Torah? How thoughtful were the rabbis and the rabbinic leadership? What were they being asked of their congregations? And how often we are asked to give a tweet or a Facebook post. And so I thought I would take my Facebook post and I would submit it. And so I'm going to read that Facebook post. And I just want to tell you it was inspired, and I don't know if it was an inspiration, but on January 7th by the first time that former President Donald Trump spoke. And he said, "Our incredible journey is only just beginning." So this was my submission. Today, when he was unmuzzled, and in parentheses I wrote, "Still, President Trump told us, our incredible journey is only just beginning." In case anyone thought that yesterday was an isolated incident or the lancing of a long festering boil, make no mistake. Yesterday's events at the United States Capitol, literally the temple of our democracy, was one more instance of the cancer of hatred, racism, and anti-Semitism, and ignorance that has been growing in this country for generations. Today, we wake to the harsh reality that democracy is not and never has been a spectator sport. If we want a strong, vibrant, and healthy democracy, each one of us who still believes in the American dream must dig in, speak up and out, and get back to work. Voting every 2 years isn't going to bring us closer to what we dream about and what everyone in this country deserves: liberty and justice for all. Over 2,000 years ago, the Babylonian Talmud in Brachot 55a taught us, a ruler is not to be appointed unless the community is first consulted. I commit myself to working against this darkness and simultaneously seeing and recognizing the incredible work that went into giving this country the first African-American and the first Jewish senators from Georgia. What will you commit yourself to today?
Okay, so I really love I know you shortened your submission, your reading for time, but you did read the part about how you talked about remaining committed to this work, how there's so much more to do than vote every 2 years, and you ask us to reflect on what we will commit to today. And so I thought it was a perfect way to end the program. You also, later in the submission, you highlight the need to fight for marginalized communities, for people of color, for LGBTQ people. And, you know, I often, in my work, trying to organize people to do exactly this work, I feel that people are overwhelmed. They're busy. There's so much work to do. We know that this conversation, of course, has highlighted the amount of work that there is to do. So I thought it would be great. I know you're involved, Rabbi Mintz, in a lot of different things and doing so much wonderful work to fight for the marginalized, to protect communities that need protection and to bring about freedom and justice for all, as you said. So I was wondering if you could give us some tangible examples beyond voting. Of course, voting is your civic duty, but how can we, you know, we talked about modeling good behavior. We talked about making sure that our language fits our ideals. What are some tangible ways that all of us can get involved and do this work and hopefully build toward a better future?
Well, in my 30 seconds left, thanks, Amanda, to tie this all together and save democracy for one and all. You have the rabbinic superpowers here. I'm very focused on this sense of back and forth and what we look at and what we apprehend during this pivotal time. And that there's tragedy and travesty, and then we look and we want inspiration and hope. And so in the darkness, we look and there's Stacey Abrams has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So that there's incredible recognition through the darkness. And it brought me back, your question just brought me back to that beautiful and evocative poem that Valerie Kaur wrote in 2016, The Sikh Prayer, where she asked, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? And that has always stuck with me in terms of how we commit ourselves, what we commit ourselves to. And obviously, not everybody in this country votes. And I think one thing as a Jewish community, as a progressive community, that we have a responsibility for is education, is to, we ask people all the time. I mean, I still feel like I'm getting texts all the time asking to contribute to something politically that's financial. And of course we can, and we can exert pressure and lift up organizations financially, but we can also do them with our feet. Not just praying with our feet, but we can go and we can galvanize our own communities many of us are congregational rabbis in our own congregations. And I think we can't forget, so many of us spoke to the necessity of engaging youth, our own children and the children in our congregations. And I think now more than ever, kids have suffered so much this past year. And I think most of them, that suffering is going to be a PTSD in many cases, that we need to commit ourselves to not only kids who are going to be voting in 2 years and voting in 4 years, but I think it is absolutely essential for education around kids in high school in this country to understand that it's not something that you heard somebody did, but it's an actual responsibility as well as a right. So I think that as rabbis who are indebted and believe, I know all of us believe in the past, the present, and the future of democracy, I personally feel that if each person who is listening to us and everybody who reads any part of the book in this country wakes up to the reality that we need to keep working, and you can look back and forth as we're looking at the terrible and the hopeful, and find a place or a foothold in there to ensure democracy is not something that is a spectator sport.
Thank you so much. So beautiful. I think this was incredibly powerful. I really can't wait to share the video with a lot of people that maybe can join us for lunchtime. But thank you all so much. And Rabbi Olitzky, please bring us home.
Sure, Amanda, we just want to thank you. Menachem and I put this together very quickly when we saw really what our colleagues were writing and the power, the raw emotions of all of it. And the title of this compilation of reflections, Remember and Do Not Forget, really based on the biblical command of how we treat what's the Amalekites, what Amalek did to Bnei Israel. And so I just want to end by reading what we wrote in the introduction, that we've done our best to collect diverse rabbinic testimonies from an indescribable moment of American history with a commitment to remember and a promise to not forget. We will not be defined by the threats of white supremacists and the acts of domestic terrorists, but they undoubtedly shape us and shape our view of the world. If we do not teach history, then history is destined to repeat itself. So thank you to my friends and colleagues for your powerful words, for your Torah, and for always inspiring me.
And thank you all for being the leaders that our community so desperately needs, for helping instill faith and confidence in the Jewish community, and reminding us of our values and our commitment to act consistent with those values and to speak consistent with those values, and to continue doing the work even when it's hard, even when it takes courage, even when it's overwhelming, because there is so much work to do. But I do think, because this is reflecting on the Shloshim, the 30 days for people who don't know, the 1 month anniversary of this event, it does feel like we're in a different world in a lot of senses. And it also feels like really nothing has changed in other senses. So let's try to hold on to the positive. Let's try to hold on to the inspirational part of that, and think about how, in a year, the 1 year anniversary of January 6th, we've all done everything that we can to move forward. Thank you so much, everyone. It was such an honor for me to be sharing this screen with such extraordinary teachers and friends.
Thank you.